The night Julian Kane offered $1 million for one night with a virgin was not about desire, it was about desperation, the kind that doesn't scream or beg but stands quietly in the shadows, watching the world lose meaning piece by piece. He wasn't looking for company or comfort. He was searching for proof that something in this world still had value beyond price. Something unspoiled, untouched, unbought, and maybe in some way still capable of saving him. The ballroom at the Whitmore Hotel shimmered under chandeliers that had seen too many secrets, filled with people who smiled too wide and drank too much, laughter echoing like rehearsed applause. Everyone dressed in wealth but drowning in emptiness. Julian stood near the far wall, watching it all unfold with a detachment that had settled into his bones, the weight of the diagnosis still echoing in his chest. Terminal neurological deterioration, the words had landed like a slow explosion, not painful at first, but irreversible. He should have gone home, should have called the lawyers, written the letters, locked himself away like every other billionaire facing the end. But instead, he followed a whispered invitation through a velvet curtain into a back room so private even the walls seemed sworn to silence, a place where the rich bid on illusions, on names without stories, on bodies reduced to numbers, and somehow that felt less cruel than what the world had already done to them. That's when he saw her. Elena Moore didn't walk in like she belonged, didn't wear designer silk or paint her lips to seduce. She looked small in her coat, her hair braided simply, her expression unreadable, not shy, not bold, just present, painfully so. And that presence hit Julian like a chord he didn't know he'd been waiting to hear. She stood in front of a group of men who treated the moment like entertainment, but she didn't flinch, didn't shrink. She looked past them all, until her eyes found his, and something settled in his chest for the first time in years. She was introduced as a first-time participant, a virgin by choice, needing funds for personal family reasons. And Julian didn't wait for the bidding to begin. He spoke once, clearly, 1 million, and the room stopped breathing. No one countered, no one laughed, because everyone knew his name, and no one challenged Julian Kane when his voice carried that kind of finality. Elena didn't blink, didn't question, she nodded once, and that nod felt heavier than any signature he had ever watched slide across a contract. He didn't take her to a suite, didn't touch her, didn't say much at all. He took her to a small apartment above an old bookstore where the walls smelled like paper and dust, where his mind could breathe, where no one expected him to be a god. He handed her a new contract, one that said 1 year instead of 1 night, companionship instead of intimacy, quiet instead of chaos. She read every word, then looked at him and asked the one question he wasn't ready for. Why me? And for the first time in a very long time, he didn't have an answer, not because he didn't care, but because he did. And somehow, deep inside, he knew she had already given him something he couldn't buy, something the money didn't touch, something his illness hadn't yet erased, and though he couldn't name it that night, it would become the only thing that mattered in the year that followed. As the world he thought he understood began to unravel, not into darkness, but into something painfully, beautifully alive. Elena Moore had never planned to sell herself, not even once, not even for a second, but life, with its cruel sense of humor, rarely consulted her plans. At 22, she had learned that survival often demanded choices that dignity could not afford. And when her younger brother collapsed in the kitchen one morning with blue lips and shaking hands, she knew the clock had started ticking louder than ever. Noah was 10, too young to understand the word surgery, old enough to feel the fear in her voice when she said everything would be fine. She had said it so many times she had started to believe it, until the hospital bill proved otherwise. They had no parents, no home to sell, only a rental apartment shared with 2 other students and a mountain of unpaid medical debt. Elena worked 2 jobs, one at a diner, one tutoring high school kids in math, and even with every dollar stretched, even with every night she skipped meals to save, She was still falling short. She never cried in front of Noah. Only in the bathroom with the faucet running, only when she was sure the world couldn't hear her break. When a girl from her college whispered about a place, a contact, a way to make everything disappear with one night, Alina laughed at first, until she didn't. She spent weeks fighting herself, weeks staring at the ceiling in the dark, wondering if one choice, one irreversible decision, could be worth a life saved. And when Noah's condition worsened and the doctor said soon, not later, she picked up the phone. She thought it would be a cold room with cruel eyes and leering men, but instead it was velvet curtains and champagne glasses and names no one said out loud. She didn't speak as the woman handed her a silk card with her name, didn't protest when the number next to her profile flashed across a private screen. She stood under the soft light, trembling on the inside, stone on the outside, until the man at the back stood up and offered $1 million without blinking. She didn't recognize him at first. Only later did the name Julian Kane sink into her bones like ice. One of the youngest billionaires in the country, known for his calculated ruthlessness, a man whose empire was built on silence and sharpness. Someone so far removed from her world it felt unreal that he even breathed the same air. When he walked up to her, she expected detachment, maybe entitlement, but instead there was stillness, his voice calm, almost careful, like he was holding something fragile inside himself. He said nothing inappropriate, didn't ask anything vulgar, only handed her an envelope with an address and said, "Come tomorrow if you choose to." And she did. Not because of the money, but because something about his eyes made her pause, not hunger or arrogance, but something closer to 8. Julian's apartment was nothing like his public persona. It wasn't a penthouse dripping with gold or a marble prison of status. It was small, 2 bedrooms, books stacked against the walls, a kitchen that smelled faintly of coffee and ink. He told her the truth within 10 minutes of her arrival, that he was dying, that his mind was unraveling, that he didn't want to die alone, or empty, or feeling like he had never once touched something real. He asked for her time, not her body. 1 year of being near, of being honest, of reminding him what it meant to be human, and in return, she could walk away with the money that would save her brother and rewrite her life. Elena didn't answer right away. She read the contract 3 times, asked questions, tested his tone for any sign of mockery or deceit, but there was none, only a strange kind of reverence, like he was asking for a favor he didn't believe he deserved. She signed, not because she trusted him, not yet, but because something inside her whispered that maybe, just maybe, he wasn't the only one looking for something real. Julian Kane had bought a year of her life, but he didn't know yet that it would cost him far more than money, because while Elena had every intention of walking away whole, he had no idea that the girl he paid for would become the only person he couldn't afford to lose. The first few weeks passed like a careful waltz neither of them had learned the steps for. Julian kept his distance, always respectful, almost too formal, as if the weight of the contract between them was a barrier he didn't know how to break. Elena respected that. She didn't press him with questions or force conversations. She moved through the apartment quietly, making tea in the mornings, folding the throw blanket he left crumpled on the couch, reading beside the window while he typed emails that rarely held meaning anymore. She hadn't expected silence to be so comfortable. Julian noticed everything, though he pretended not to. The way she hummed under her breath while slicing fruit, how she always double-checked the front door lock even though the building was secure, the way she flinched slightly at loud noises but smiled when sunlight hit the corner of the kitchen counter in the late afternoon. She fascinated him, not in the way women usually fascinated men like him, but in the way he hadn't known he could still be fascinated at all. He started to change his schedule. Meetings moved to afternoons so his mornings were free. Emails were delayed so he could sit across from her during breakfast, not saying much, just listening to the way she sipped her coffee and scribbled in her notebook. At first she wrote down numbers and hospital notes for her brother's recovery, but later he saw sketches, small ones, pencil lines forming people in mid-laugh, or streets blurred with rain. One evening, she left a drawing on the counter, a quiet piece showing his hand resting near a cup of untouched coffee. She never said she drew it, but she didn't need to. And they began talking more, slowly at first, conversations that started with weather and errands and drifted into childhood stories, fears they rarely admitted to anyone, favorite books, bad dreams, things they regretted. Julian told her about the time he was 14 and walked out of a math competition just because no one came to watch him. She told him about the day she realized she was more of a parent than a sister to her brother, and she hadn't been a child since. Sometimes the words weren't heavy, but the silence between them always carried weight. One night, the power flickered during a thunderstorm and the lights went out completely. Julian froze, visibly shaken, and Elena, without asking, found a candle in the drawer, lit it, and sat beside him on the floor, close enough to offer comfort but far enough not to make it about pity. He whispered then, voice barely audible, that he hated the dark because it reminded him of how fast his mind was slipping. She didn't say it would be okay. She just sat there, shoulder brushing his, steady and still, like a lighthouse for someone lost in fog. She started cooking more often, experimenting with simple recipes from her childhood. Julian pretended not to be impressed, but cleared every plate she served. One afternoon, he walked into the kitchen and found her dancing barefoot to a song playing from her phone, unaware he was watching. For a moment, time stilled. She looked free, not like the girl who sold a year of her life, but like the version of herself untouched by pain. When she noticed him, she blushed and apologized, but he only said, "Don't stop." The tension between them built gradually, like water rising behind a dam. It wasn't about touch or flirtation. It was the intimacy of shared mornings, of inside jokes that didn't need words, of the way he started recognizing her footsteps from the elevator, and how she instinctively knew when he needed space. She never asked about his condition again, but she noticed. The way his hands trembled sometimes when he typed, the slight pauses in his speech when he was tired, the day he forgot which cabinet held the glasses and stood in the kitchen for 5 minutes unmoving. She didn't panic. She walked up, opened the right cabinet, handed him a glass, and went back to slicing apples. No pity, just presence. And it nearly broke him. One evening he returned from a meeting earlier than expected and found her asleep on the couch, head resting against a cushion, a book half finished on her chest. The lamp beside her cast a soft glow over her face, and he watched her for a long time, feeling something he couldn't name settle deep into his bones. She looked so real, so permanent, like she belonged in that space, and for the first time, he allowed himself to wonder what it would feel like to keep her there. But the contract loomed like a silent clock in the background. Julian reminded himself daily that she was here because he paid for her time, not her feelings, that what he felt building between them couldn't be real. It wasn't fair, not to her, not to him, and yet he began craving her presence in ways that had nothing to do with the agreement. One morning, she brought him coffee before he asked, said she noticed he always hesitated before drinking the strong blend his assistant bought. She had made it lighter, with cinnamon. He sipped, surprised, and didn't speak. She smiled and said, "You're allowed to like small things, even now?" Another day, she found an old record player in a closet and dusted it off, played soft jazz on a rainy afternoon, and danced with herself until he finally stood and took her hand. They moved awkwardly, barely a dance at all, but her laughter melted the stiffness in his shoulders. It was the first time he laughed without fear of forgetting why. And then came the night when everything almost changed. They were sitting on the balcony, the city stretched out like a painting below them, and she asked, "What scares you most?" He didn't answer immediately. When he did, his voice was quiet. "That I'll die having never really been loved." She looked at him, long and steady, and said, "Then don't die yet." He turned to face her fully, reached out as if to touch her cheek, but stopped short. His hand hovered in the air for a breath too long. She didn't lean into it. She didn't pull away. They stayed like that for several seconds, frozen between a choice and a promise. And then she whispered, "I'm still here, aren't I?" He lowered his hand slowly and nodded, not because he believed it yet, but because for the first time he wanted to. She hadn't told him what he meant to her. She hadn't tried to break down his walls, but every quiet gesture, every ordinary moment she made extraordinary, chipped away at something he thought was untouchable. Julian Kane had hired her to remind him what it meant to live. He just hadn't expected her to become the reason he wanted to. Elena never asked for more than what was written in the contract, but every day she gave more than what could ever be promised. Julian began to depend on her presence without realizing it, until one morning she was late. Just 20 minutes, no message, no call. He told himself it didn't matter that people got delayed, that she had her own life. But when she walked in breathless, cheeks flushed from the cold, clutching a bag of pastries she had gone out of her way to find because she overheard him mention them weeks ago, something in him settled and ached at the same time. That afternoon, she made tea while he sat silently, watching the steam rise, and asked if he was okay. He lied and said he was fine, and she didn't press. Instead, she told him Noah had drawn him a thank you card and was learning to ride a bike. Julian held the card for nearly 10 minutes without speaking, running his fingers over the stick figures and shaky hearts. Later that night, after she went to bed, he sat alone in the kitchen and stared at the contract again, rereading the dates, as if they were counting down to something he didn't want to reach. It wasn't just her presence that changed the air in his home. It was the way she saw him, not as a billionaire or a man with a timeline, but as someone trying to matter to himself for the first time in years. And he began to see her too, really see her beyond the girl who needed the money. She was brilliant, stubborn, kind in ways that weren't loud but unforgettable. She spent hours on the phone with her brother, encouraged strangers on forums who didn't know her name, and when she thought no one was listening, she hummed lullabies under her breath that her mother used to sing. One night, as he watched her from the doorway of the living room, curled up with a blanket and a book, he remembered a moment from his childhood, a rare afternoon when his mother made grilled cheese and read to him on a rainy day. He hadn't thought about her in years. Elena had somehow resurrected parts of him that he didn't even know still existed, and that terrified him. Days later, Julian received a call from his physician. The scans had changed. There was deterioration in areas they hadn't expected this soon. He didn't tell her. He should have, but he didn't. Not out of pride, but fear that if she knew how close the end really was, she would start preparing to leave. He needed her to stay just a little longer. Not as part of the agreement, but because without her, every part of his carefully built world felt hollow again. But Elena already knew. She had noticed the subtle signs, how he paused mid-sentence and restarted entire thoughts, how he touched his temples more often, as if holding something together. She didn't confront him. Instead, she began writing things down, creating reminders he wouldn't notice were reminders. Notes in his notebooks that read, "Your glasses are in the kitchen," or "The light switch on the balcony is loose." She made his world easier, without asking for acknowledgement. Then one evening, she found him sitting on the floor of his study, eyes distant, a record playing softly in the background, and a sketch she had drawn in his hands, the one of his coffee cup in hand. He looked up at her, and for the first time there was panic in his expression, not from confusion, but from awareness. He whispered, "I couldn't remember how to turn it off." I stood there staring at the switch, and it felt like a stranger's house. Elena crossed the room without hesitation, sat beside him, and said, "Then we'll make it familiar again, every time." She told him the truth then that she had known for weeks, that she didn't need him to be strong, that she was here not because of money, but because she cared. He asked why. She said, "Because you're not gone yet, and you're worth staying for." Julian broke then. The walls he had spent decades perfecting didn't just crack, they collapsed. He told her about the dreams he didn't have anymore, about the fear of forgetting her name, about the nights he woke up unsure if he was still real. She didn't try to reassure him with false hope. She simply reached for his hand and held it, grounding him in the moment, in her, in now. They started keeping a journal together. Each night, she would ask him to describe one thing from that day, a smell, a sound, a thought. Sometimes he gave her a full paragraph, sometimes just a word. But the ritual anchored him. It gave structure to the chaos. And then came the morning he left the apartment without telling her. She found a note on the counter. Don't worry, needed to be somewhere. Her heart pounded as she called his driver, who said Julian had instructed him to stay behind. She searched for him for hours before she thought to check the bookstore downstairs. There he was, sitting in the corner, surrounded by old paperbacks, staring at a copy of a poetry book he had once mentioned his mother loved. He looked up when she approached, tears threatening behind his calm eyes, and said, "I just wanted to see if I could still find my way back to something." She didn't lecture him. She knelt beside him and whispered, "You did." That night, they sat on the rooftop. The city lights flickered below them and the wind carried the smell of rain. Julian turned to her and asked, "If I didn't have time left, would you still have come?" She said, "I didn't come for time. I came because something in you called something in me." And it never had a clock. He reached for her hand then, not like before, not hesitant or rehearsed, but fully, as if he finally understood what it meant to be touched and trusted at the same time. And as she curled her fingers into his, he said the words that had lived in him unspoken for months. "I didn't buy you. You gave yourself, and I have nothing to give back that feels enough." She leaned her head on his shoulder and said, "Then just be here. That's already everything." In that moment, Julian understood the cost of what he had received. Not the money, not the contract, but the grace of being chosen, freely, by someone who had every reason to walk away. And now, he knew he would spend whatever time he had left, not running from the end, but living fully in whatever they had begun. Not because he paid for it, but because she made it matter. The days that followed felt almost suspended in time, as if the world outside Julian's apartment had slowed down to let them breathe. He began sleeping more, not out of weakness, but comfort, as if something in Elena's quiet presence allowed his body to rest in ways it hadn't in years. She stayed longer now, sometimes arriving early enough to make breakfast and sometimes staying late enough that she would fall asleep on the couch, wrapped in one of his sweaters, her bare feet tucked under her legs, her face peaceful in the low glow of the kitchen light. He started memorizing those moments, not in desperation, but reverence, each one like a photograph pressed into the fragile walls of his mind. He no longer fought against forgetting. Instead, he fought to remember everything about her, the way she laughed with her eyes first, how she stirred her tea exactly 3 times, the tiny scar on her collarbone she never talked about, and the way her voice softened when she spoke about her brother. She had become his anchor, his compass, the only thing keeping him tethered to himself when everything else threatened to dissolve. Then one afternoon something shifted. Julian had invited her to accompany him to a private gallery showing, a quiet event filled with collectors and art dealers and the occasional whisper of his name. Elena wore a simple black dress with sleeves that grazed her wrists, and her hair pulled back in a way that revealed her jawline, soft but proud. She didn't walk beside him like an accessory. She walked like someone who belonged at his side, and everyone noticed. Eyes followed them, lips whispered behind champagne glasses, and Julian felt an old tension rise in his chest, the need to protect her from the version of his world that fed on scandal and speculation. During the event, a woman approached them. Tall, poised, the kind of socialite who smiled with only half her mouth and spoke in veiled insults. She greeted Julian with exaggerated warmth, then turned to Elena with a polite curiosity laced in condescension. "And who is this?" she asked. The new assistant? The flavor of the month? Or just another pretty secret the world isn't supposed to know? Julian's jaw tightened, but Elena, to his surprise, didn't flinch. She smiled, extended her hand, and said, "I'm the reason he remembers what it means to be human." The woman blinked, caught off guard, then walked away without another word. Julian looked at her then, not with pride or amusement, but something heavier, gratitude, that he couldn't articulate without breaking. But the night didn't end there. When they returned to the apartment, the air between them was quieter than usual. Julian poured 2 glasses of wine and handed her one, his fingers brushing hers in a way that lingered longer than necessary. She sat across from him on the couch, her knees curled, the hem of her dress brushing the floor, and for the first time, he didn't look away. "I never asked why you stayed," he said, his voice low, almost cautious. "Because you stopped being someone I could walk away from," she replied. He studied her face, the honesty in her eyes, the way she didn't blink or falter. "I told myself this was about time, about having someone near before I disappear, but now it feels like the time only matters because you're the one spending it with me." She looked at him then, fully, as if weighing a truth too big to carry casually. "I wasn't supposed to feel anything," she admitted. "Not for you, not for this. I came because I needed help, but I stayed because you gave me something I didn't know I was allowed to want. And it wasn't money, it was meaning." He reached for her hand again, slower this time, intentional, and when their fingers laced together, he felt something electric move through him, not lust, not possession, but something sacred, like acknowledgement. She moved closer, not with urgency, but with clarity, and when he leaned in, their lips met in a kiss that was more confession than contact. It wasn't perfect, it wasn't polished, but it was real. When they finally pulled away, she whispered, "I'm scared." "So am I," he replied. "But I want this. So do I." That night, they didn't fall into bed like strangers pretending to be lovers. They moved slowly, cautiously, learning each other with patience and respect, with whispered reassurances and careful touches, not as a fulfillment of a contract, but as a choice between 2 people who had nothing left to hide. He had never been with someone who treated him like he was breakable, not because he was weak, but because he was worth holding gently, and she had never been with someone who saw her as whole, even before she gave herself. And in the early hours of the morning, as they lay tangled in warmth and silence, Julian touched her face and said, "I'm not afraid of dying anymore. Not because I want to go, but because for the first time, I know what I'll be missing." Elena didn't respond with words. She just pressed her forehead to his, closed her eyes, and memorized the sound of his breath, the weight of his hand against her back, the quiet rhythm of a man who had finally let himself be seen. The days that followed blurred in a rhythm they had come to understand without words, a routine that felt almost sacred in its simplicity. Morning coffee with barely opened eyes, soft jazz playing in the background, while Elena curled her legs on the sofa and read aloud from poetry books Julian had never cared about before she arrived. Now those words clung to his memory like anchors, keeping him steady in a sea of forgetting. Each day they created moments that could outlast the things slipping through his mind's grasp, shared dinners filled with quiet laughter, scribbled notes tucked into kitchen drawers, even lists taped inside cabinet doors that helped him find things when the fog pressed in. They were building something invisible, but undeniable, a life that existed inside a borrowed year. But no matter how much they tried to outrun the truth, it came for them one afternoon, wrapped inside a white envelope with a red stamp. Julian had left it on the counter, unopened, a letter from his private physician with test results he already suspected the contents of. Elena found it by accident while cleaning up, and for a moment she just stared at it, frozen, as if the paper could bite. She knew the moment he entered the room and saw it in her hands. Something shifted in his eyes, not anger, but weariness, the look of a man who didn't want to keep secrets anymore. "You read it, didn't you?" he asked, voice quiet. She nodded. I didn't mean to. I just saw your name and— It's okay, he said, sitting down slowly. It's not good news. She sat beside him, close enough to feel the heaviness radiating off him like heat, her voice almost a whisper. How much worse? They said weeks, maybe less if the regression speeds up. Her breath hitched, but she didn't look away. Instead, she reached for his hand, fingers trembling as they laced with his. Then let's not waste what's left pretending we don't know. Julian leaned back, closed his eyes, and exhaled as if he'd been holding the air in for days. I don't want you to watch me fall apart, he said. I wanted to protect you from it. You never had to, she replied. You didn't need to be strong for me, you just had to be honest. That night, something in their rhythm changed, not in the way they moved or spoke, but in what they no longer avoided. They started talking about what came next, not in despair but in acceptance, how they would make every day count, how Julian would begin to transfer things in his will to ensure her and Noah's future, how he would write letters to be opened later, not as goodbyes, but as reminders of what mattered. They spent a weekend at a small cabin by a lake, away from the city noise and headlines and boardroom calls. Julian cooked breakfast for the first time in months, burning the eggs and laughing so hard it made him cough. Elena took pictures of him in an old sweatshirt, hair messy, eyes brighter than any version of him captured in magazines. They made love under soft blankets with windows fogged by rain and whispered stories into each other's necks, as if trying to tattoo the words onto skin. But love, no matter how carefully nurtured, cannot shield itself forever. On a rainy Tuesday, Elena returned from the pharmacy to find a woman sitting in the apartment lobby, elegant, sharp-eyed, holding a leather portfolio and waiting like she had every right to be there. She introduced herself as Julian's legal advisor, requested 5 minutes of her time, and without waiting, handed her a document outlining trust allocations, estate transfers, beneficiary clauses, all signed and notarized with Elena's name now embedded into the skeleton of Julian's legacy. He didn't tell you, did he? The woman asked. I warned him you deserved to know, especially since the media will twist it, but he insisted, said she doesn't want the money, she wants me. Elena felt her stomach twist, not from the money, not even from the secrecy, but from the quiet ache that came with understanding how deeply Julian feared losing her, how hard he had tried to create safety without asking permission. That night, she didn't confront him with anger. Instead, she walked into the apartment, found him in the kitchen, and handed him the folder. You didn't have to do this behind my back, she said, her voice firm but gentle. I would have understood. I didn't want it to change the way you looked at me, he whispered. And I didn't want you to feel obligated to stay. Julian, I stayed because I love you, she said, not because of what you can leave behind, but because of what you've given me already. You gave me peace when I thought survival was all I could ask for. For a moment he couldn't speak, only pulled her into his arms, held her like a man clutching the last solid thing in a world dissolving around him. I don't have long, he said, but I have enough to make sure you never question how much you meant to me. That weekend, they went back to the place where it all began, the quiet apartment above the bookstore. Julian had it cleaned and restored, left untouched since the early months. They sat on the floor with takeout containers and old music playing, surrounded by memories too loud to ignore, and in that room where he had first offered her a year of borrowed time, she gave him something he had never dared to ask for. A promise, not for forever, but for always. I'll stay, she said, even when the words slip. Even when you forget what day it is, I'll still be here, and I'll keep reminding you of who you are until the very last moment. He looked at her then, truly looked, and with tears that blurred the edges of his vision, said, You're the only thing I've ever had that made me believe I was more than what I built. She smiled, pressed her forehead to his, and whispered, And you're the only one who ever made me feel like I was enough just by being myself. They didn't need vows, or a stage, or an audience to witness them. They had already made their promises in the quiet hours, between shared cups of tea and silent grief and stolen joy. And in that stillness, they chose love again. Not because it was easy, but because it was real, and for people like them, that was the only thing that mattered. 3 weeks later, the apartment was filled with more light than usual. Sun pooled through the windows, soft and golden, casting warmth over the kitchen where Julian sat wrapped in a wool cardigan, Elena beside him, her hand resting gently on his. He had become quieter these days, his thoughts coming slower, his words sometimes trailing off mid-sentence, but she never rushed him, never filled the silence with anything but presence. He smiled more now, not with his mouth but with his eyes, and every time he looked at her, it was like he was trying to memorize her again, as if that memory might last longer than all the others. That morning, she read to him from a letter he had written months ago but forgotten, a note addressed to her in handwriting that had since become shakier, and though he didn't recall writing it, he cried anyway. He cried because the words were true, and because somehow he still felt everything they said. "I used to think I could buy everything," it began, "but I've learned that some things, like the way you hold your breath when you're nervous, or the way you laugh when you forget I'm watching, those things can't be bought, only received, only earned." That evening, as the city began to glow beneath the setting sun, Julian rested with his head in her lap, eyes fluttering closed, her fingers weaving slowly through his hair. He whispered one word before sleep found him, "Stay," and she did. Long after his breathing evened out, long after the lights dimmed and the sky turned indigo, she stayed. She stayed through the longest night, through the final whisper of breath, through the stillness that followed. The funeral was private, just a few people, no press, no headlines, just the ones who mattered. Elena stood in the back of the chapel, not wearing black, but the soft blue sweater Julian had once said reminded him of calm water. She didn't speak publicly, didn't need to. The story between them didn't live in eulogies or speeches. It lived in the quiet, in the life they had carved out of time neither of them expected. Weeks passed. Spring arrived, and one morning Elena returned to the bookstore where he used to disappear when the noise of his world got too loud. She placed a worn sketchbook on the shelf behind the poetry section where he used to sit, and inside she had drawn every moment that mattered, the first coffee, the first real smile, the first time she stayed past midnight. As she stepped out into the morning light, her phone buzzed. A message from Julian's lawyer, just one line, "The last letter is waiting for you." She smiled, heart aching and full, and walked on. Because what he gave her couldn't be measured in wealth or years. He gave her the kind of love that doesn't need forever to be real, the kind of love that turns strangers into homes, the kind of love that teaches you that even borrowed time can leave behind something permanent. Somewhere, deep in the quiet of memory, his voice lingered. "I offered you money," it said, "but you gave me something no price could ever touch." And Elena whispered back, as she walked down the street toward whatever came next, "You gave me the same." Because sometimes a love built in borrowed time can outlive everything, even the clock itself.